Chapter 11. Surrounded. The wind howled through the trees, but it wasn't the wind that made Alyssa's skin crawl. She stood by the window, staring out into the dark woods. The snow-covered clearing stretched quiet and empty, but she could feel it. Something was out there, watching, waiting. Lachlan sat by the fire, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. He hadn't said much since they returned from Kael's camp. That alone told Alyssa everything she needed to know. Kael was coming, and it wouldn't be subtle. "I'm guessing we didn't scare them off," Alyssa muttered, her voice cutting through the silence. Lachlan glanced up, his golden eyes flickering in the firelight. "No, we just made him mad." Alyssa sighed, gripping the edge of the windowsill. Great. Nothing like poking a bear with a stick. Lachlan smirked faintly. Or a wolf. She rolled her eyes, but didn't smile. The uneasy feeling in her chest wouldn't let her. The attack came after midnight. Alyssa woke to the sound of howling, low, bone-chilling, and too close to the cabin. She bolted upright, heart pounding, and reached for the rifle she kept by the bed. Lachlan was already at the front door, peering out. His bare shoulders were tense, muscles flexing beneath the dim glow of the lantern. "They're here," he said, voice low. Alyssa tightened her grip on the rifle. "How many?" "Too many." She pulled on her coat, shoving her feet into thick boots as the howls grew louder. Then came the scratching. Claws scraped against the walls outside, sharp and deliberate. It wasn't random. They were testing the cabin's defenses. Alyssa's breath hitched. "They're trying to get in." Lachlan stepped forward, pressing his palm against the door, as if that alone could hold them back. "They won't." But he didn't sound so sure. A heavy thud rattled the side of the cabin, followed by growls. Alyssa swore she could feel the vibration through the floorboards. "Are they throwing themselves at the walls?" she asked, incredulous. Lachlan's jaw tightened. "They're trying to scare you." "Well, congratulations," Alyssa muttered. "It's working." Lachlan turned to her, eyes softening. "Stay inside. I'll handle this." Before she could argue, Lachlan shifted, his body contorting and growing until his massive wolf form stood where he had been. With one last glance at Alyssa, he slipped out the door, disappearing into the snowy night. The sounds outside were worse than she expected. Growls, snarls, and the heavy clash of bodies slamming into each other echoed around the cabin. Alyssa stayed by the window, peering out into the darkness. Flashes of movement flickered at the edge of the clearing. Shadows of wolves circling just beyond her line of sight. The cabin shuddered again, and Alyssa gripped the rifle tighter. She wanted to help, but stepping outside felt like signing her own death certificate. So she waited. The battle outside raged for what felt like hours. Finally, the howling faded, replaced by eerie silence. Alyssa opened the door cautiously, snow crunching beneath her boots as she stepped onto the porch. Lachlan stood near the tree line, breathing heavily, his fur streaked with blood that wasn't his. A few dark shapes limped away, disappearing into the woods. "They're gone?" Alyssa asked quietly. Lachlan shifted back, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "For now." Alyssa frowned. That felt easy. Lachlan met her gaze, and she saw the same unease she felt deep in her gut. "He's holding back," Lachlan admitted. Alyssa shivered, though not from the cold. Why? Lachlan looked out into the trees, his eyes narrowed. Because this is just the beginning. The next morning, Alyssa felt the ground tremble and shake. Claw marks stretched across the cabin walls, deep and deliberate, but the structure still stood strong. As she made her way around to the side window, something stopped her cold. Wolf prints, large and distinct, led up to the window. They stopped just beneath the glass, as if someone had stood there, staring in. Her stomach twisted. Kael had been watching her. Lachlan appeared beside her, his gaze falling on the tracks. His eyes darkened. "He's getting closer," Alyssa said quietly. Lachlan's hand brushed against hers, a small but steadying gesture. "He won't touch you," he promised. Alyssa nodded, but as she stared at the prints leading away from the cabin, she wasn't so sure. She smiled, thinking he was planning something surprising. Alyssa knew something was wrong the moment she flipped the light switch, and nothing happened. It looked like someone had taken a sledgehammer to the panels, repeatedly. Alyssa's stomach sank. "Lachlan!" she yelled, scanning the tree line. A few seconds later, Lachlan emerged from the woods, his sharp eyes narrowing as soon as he saw the mess. "Kael," he said, kneeling to inspect the damage. "It's not like the wind decided to get creative." Lachlan stood, dusting snow off his hands. "They're cutting off resources. They want to drive you out." Alyssa huffed. "Yeah, well, I'm not going anywhere." Lachlan raised an eyebrow. "You're not listening. No power means no heat. And if they hit the water supply next..." The sound of running water suddenly sputtered and died from inside the cabin. Alyssa froze. "You have to be kidding me." Lachlan didn't say a word, but his expression said it all. By the time they made it to the pump near the shed, Alyssa was already fuming. She knelt beside the well, peering down into the darkness. "Cut," she muttered, tugging on the frayed remains of the water line. "They cut the damn pipe." Lachlan crossed his arms, his golden eyes scanning the area. "They're trying to make this impossible for you." "Oh, I got that, thanks." Alyssa stood, tossing the severed hose onto the snow. "Seriously, what's next? Are they going to let the air out of my tires?" Lachlan's face remained serious. "It's not funny, Alyssa," she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know." Lachlan stepped closer. "We can leave, just for a while. Regroup somewhere else." Alyssa crossed her arms, shaking her head. "No." "Alyssa." "I said no," she repeated, glaring at him. "I'm not abandoning the cabin. I built this place with my own hands. I'm not letting Kael or anyone else scare me out of it." Lachlan held her gaze for a long moment. "You're stubborn," he finally said, though there was a trace of admiration in his voice. "I've been called worse," Alyssa replied. He smirked faintly, but didn't push the issue. "Fine," he said, "but I'm staying close. If Kael wants to mess with you, he'll have to get through me first." Alyssa gave him a small nod, feeling oddly comforted by his presence, but deep down, she knew Kael wasn't the type to stop at sabotaging solar panels. He wanted more. That night, Alyssa lay awake, listening to the wind scratch against the cabin. The fire flickered low, casting long shadows across the room. She told herself it was fine. They could manage without power for a while. Lachlan had already rigged up a backup water source from the stream. Still, sleep wouldn't come. Alyssa finally drifted off, just as the sky began to lighten. But when she woke the next morning, something else was waiting. A shadow stood outside her cabin. Alyssa rubbed her eyes, heart skipping as she peered out the frost-covered window. Kael. He stood on her front porch in human form, arms crossed, wearing a long dark coat that barely seemed to register the cold. His hair hung loose around his shoulders, and his sharp features twisted into a faint smile as he caught her staring. Alyssa's blood ran cold. Before she could react, Kael raised his hand and knocked, slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. Alyssa grabbed the rifle from beside the door but didn't open it. Kael's voice carried through the wood. "Open up, Alyssa," he said smoothly. "I'm just here to talk." "Funny," she called back, aiming the rifle squarely at the door. "I don't remember inviting you over for coffee." Kael chuckled softly. "I'm not here for coffee. I'm here to offer you a deal." Alyssa didn't lower the rifle. "Not interested." "I think you'll want to hear this," Kael said, his tone cold and calm. "Listen to me. If you don't let us slip away, this will be a very bad day." She stayed silent, finger resting near the trigger. After a pause, Kael continued. "Turn Lachlan over to me," he said, "and I'll leave you and your precious cabin alone." Alyssa's grip tightened. She could almost feel Lachlan watching from the shadows behind her, waiting to see what she'd say. But Alyssa didn't hesitate. "Guess you'll be staying a while," she said. Kael's smile never wavered. "I figured you'd say that." With that, he turned and disappeared into the snow-covered woods. But Alyssa knew he'd be back. Chapter 12. Shadows of Doubt. Alyssa sat by the fire, staring at the flickering flames, but all she could see was Kael's face. His voice echoed in her head, smooth and calm. "Turn Lachlan over and I'll leave you alone." Simple, clear, and way too tempting. She shook her head, pressing her hands to her face. What's wrong with me? Lachlan had done nothing but protect her. He'd saved her life, more than once. But now she couldn't stop thinking about Kael's offer. A life without werewolves scratching at her door. A life without constant danger. Was it really that selfish to want things to go back to normal? The thought made her stomach twist. She wasn't used to depending on anyone. It had been just her for so long. Just Alyssa, the cabin, and the quiet. When things got messy, she walked away. It was easier, but you can't walk away from this. Lachlan's life was tangled with hers now, like it or not. She glanced at the door, half expecting Kael to stroll back in like he owned the place. Part of her wondered if he was still out there, watching from the trees. Alyssa exhaled, sinking lower into the chair. This wasn't her fight. It never had been. But the idea of handing Lachlan over, it felt wrong. Didn't it? Lachlan found her outside later that afternoon, standing by the ruined solar panels. She hadn't even realized she'd wandered out there. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but careful, like he already knew the answer. Alyssa crossed her arms, not looking at him. "Yes, just thinking about Kael." Her stomach flipped. "How does he always know?" Maybe, she muttered, kicking at the snow with her boot. "Hard not to, you know, After he casually dropped by with a deal. Lachlan stepped closer. You didn't answer him. That's what matters. Alyssa finally turned to face him. Yeah, but I thought about it. Lachlan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. You wouldn't be human if you didn't, he said, but his voice was a little colder now. Alyssa hated the way that made her feel, like she'd done something wrong, even though nothing had actually happened. I mean, can you blame me? She said, folding her arms tighter. I've been dragged into this whole thing, and all I wanted was to live in peace. Now I've got wolves attacking my house, and my power's out. Lachlan's jaw tightened. I didn't ask for you to be part of this, Alyssa. I've done everything I can to protect you. She exhaled slowly, trying to keep her voice steady. I know. But Kael's right about one thing. This would all stop if you weren't here. The words felt heavier than she meant them to. Lachlan stared at her for a long moment. So that's what you think, he said, his voice quieter now. Alyssa looked away, guilt curling in her chest. I don't know what I think. I'm just tired of being afraid. Lachlan didn't reply right away. Finally he nodded, stepping back. I get it. That was the problem. He did get it, too well. But somehow that made her feel worse. By the time the sun set, Alyssa was still replaying the conversation in her head, over and over. She sat by the fire, staring at the door like she expected Lachlan to walk out and not come back. But he didn't. Instead, he sat by the window, keeping watch like he always did. Quiet, distant. The air between them felt heavier than it ever had, and Alyssa hated every second of it. Alyssa stood in front of the cabin, knife in hand, the blade biting into the wooden beams as she carved. Her breaths came out in short clouds, and her fingers ached from the cold, but she didn't stop. The symbols Lachlan had shown her were rough. Her lines weren't nearly as smooth as his, but she didn't care. This was her land, her home, and she was done waiting for Kael to burn it down around her. Behind her, Lachlan watched quietly, arms crossed. You don't have to do all of them tonight, he said after a while. We can come back tomorrow. Alyssa wiped snow from her nose with the back of her sleeve. I do. Lachlan raised an eyebrow. You that eager to destroy the structural integrity of your cabin? She smirked. If it keeps Kael out, I'll carve all the way through the walls. Lachlan chuckled softly, but there was pride in his eyes. This time, he didn't argue. They spent the rest of the afternoon gathering supplies, traps, extra firewood, and anything else they thought might give them an edge. Corbin arrived just before dusk, dragging 2 large duffel bags behind him. You called for backup, Corbin said, dropping the bags onto the porch with a heavy thud. And by backup, I mean me. Alyssa raised an eyebrow at the sheer number of weapons inside the bags. Where did you even get all this? Corbin grinned. I have hobbies. I think you mean issues, Lachlan muttered, but he grabbed a crossbow anyway. Both can be true, Corbin replied cheerfully. Alyssa smirked, but beneath the humor, tension still ran thick. They all felt it, the quiet before something much worse. So, Corbin said, leaning against the railing, what's the plan? Alyssa glanced at Lachlan before stepping forward. We lure Kael here, she said, voice steady. He's been circling for days. Let's give him a reason to walk right into the clearing. Lachlan frowned. You sure about that? Once he's here, he won't just leave. Alyssa met his gaze, unwavering. Good. I don't want him to. For a second, Lachlan said nothing. Then slowly, he nodded. If we're doing this, we'll need to reinforce the perimeter, he said, and set traps, more than the ones we already have. Corbin grinned. I like this side of you, Alyssa. Aggressive. Don't get used to it, she replied. As night fell, the three of them worked in near silence. Alyssa set tripwires near the tree line, while Lachlan scattered a mixture of ash and salt along the outer boundary. Corbin stayed closer to the cabin, reinforcing the doors and windows with thick planks. The tension between Alyssa and Lachlan from the night before lingered, but it felt different now. She didn't apologize. Neither did he, but something unspoken had shifted, like they both understood where the other stood. By the time the moon rose high over the trees, Alyssa's back ached, and her hands were raw, but the cabin was ready. At least, she thought it was. As she stepped back inside, her gaze lingered on the symbols she'd carved along the doorframe. The rooms looked ancient, like they'd been there forever. Will they hold? She asked quietly. Lachlan hesitated before answering. They'll help. Alyssa frowned. Not exactly the confidence boost I was hoping for. He stepped closer, brushing his fingers against the carvings lightly. Kael won't get past these easily, but he's not stupid. Alyssa crossed her arms, leaning against the door. So, he's already planning something? Lachlan met her gaze, his eyes softening just a little. He's always one step ahead. Alyssa's heart sank at those words, but she forced a smile. Well, maybe for once we'll surprise him. Lachlan smirked, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. As Alyssa turned to head inside, she missed the faint shape that shifted in the trees. Kael had already been there, and the next move was his. Chapter 13. Holding the Line. Alyssa barely had time to breathe before the first howl split the night air. She dropped the bundle of firewood she'd been carrying, heart racing as the sound echoed through the clearing. It was closer than before. Much closer. Lachlan stepped onto the porch, eyes narrowing as he scanned the tree line. Corbin was already at his side, loading bolts into his crossbow. Whoa! Corbin said, his usual smirk gone. Looks like Kael didn't get the invite to wait until morning. Lachlan growled low in his throat. He's impatient. Alyssa grabbed her rifle from inside the door, checking the ammunition. Guess we'll have to entertain him. Before Lachlan could respond, something shifted in the shadows. A large, dark wolf emerged from the woods, its eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Another wolf followed, then another. Fantastic, Alyssa muttered. They brought the whole family. Lachlan tensed, golden eyes flickering as his body prepared to shift. Stay close to the cabin. If things go south... I'm not running, Alyssa cut in sharply. We've been over this. Lachlan shot her a quick glance, but didn't argue. The wolves crept forward, their low growls vibrating through the cold night air. And then they charged. Lachlan shifted mid-sprint, colliding with the first wolf in a flurry of snarls and flashing teeth. Corbin fired, his bolt striking another wolf in the shoulder, sending it howling back into the woods. Alyssa braced herself as a third wolf veered toward her, its eyes locked on her like she was the easiest target. Not tonight. She aimed low, squeezing the trigger. The shot rang out, striking the wolf's front leg. It skidded to a stop, growling in pain but still upright. "Stubborn," Alyssa muttered, cocking the rifle again. Before she could fire, Lachlan's wolf form leapt between them, slamming into the injured wolf and driving it to the ground. Alyssa exhaled in relief, but the feeling didn't last. A fourth wolf appeared from the side, its teeth flashing as it lunged. Lachlan twisted, intercepting the attack, but not before the wolf sank its fangs into his shoulder. Lachlan let out a sharp yelp, shaking the wolf off, but blood stained his fur as he staggered back. "Lachlan!" Alyssa shouted. He stayed on his feet, but just barely. Corbin fired another bolt, missing the wolf by inches. "Keep them off him," Alyssa yelled, sprinting toward the trap line. Corbin nodded, reloading quickly. Alyssa dropped to one knee, fumbling with the tripwire she had set earlier. As another wolf approached, she gave the wire a sharp tug, triggering the snare. A log swung down from the trees, slamming into the wolf and knocking it to the ground. It didn't get back up. Corbin let out a low whistle. "All right, I take it back. You might actually be terrifying." Alyssa smirked, but didn't stop moving. Another wolf was circling Lachlan, waiting for him to fall. "Not happening." Alyssa grabbed the nearest trap, a basic pitfall hidden under the snow, and shifted her stance. She whistled sharply. "Hey, Fluffy!" she shouted at the wolf. The wolf turned, snarling as it charged her instead. Alyssa stood her ground. At the last second, she sidestepped, letting the wolf stumble directly into the pit. It yelped as it hit the bottom, scrabbling at the sides but unable to climb out. "Looks like you're staying there tonight," Alyssa muttered. Lachlan limped toward her, shifting back into human form as he clutched his bleeding shoulder. "You okay?" Alyssa asked, breathless. He winced. "Could be worse. Nice work with the traps." Alyssa smiled faintly. "Guess I learned from the best." Corbin jogged over, lowering his crossbow. "I think that's the last of them, for now." The clearing was quiet, save for the occasional growl from the pit. The snow was marked with footprints and streaks of red, but they had held the line. For a moment, Alyssa felt victorious. Then she noticed it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the shadows, stood Kael. He leaned casually against a tree, arms crossed, watching them with an unsettling calmness. Alyssa tightened her grip on the rifle, but Kael didn't move. He smiled faintly, as if the entire skirmish had been nothing more than entertainment. Then, just as silently as he had appeared, Kael disappeared into the woods. A chill ran down Alyssa's spine. "We won tonight," Lachlan said beside her, his voice low. Alyssa nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on the spot where Kael had stood. "Yeah," she whispered, "but he wanted us to." Alyssa sat on the porch steps, staring out at the quiet forest. The snow-covered trees stretched endlessly in every direction, still and peaceful under the moonlight. Too peaceful. Her gut told her something was coming. It always did. Lachlan leaned against the railing beside her, rolling his shoulder and wincing slightly. His injury from the last fight wasn't healing as fast as usual. Alyssa pretended not to notice. "You're quiet tonight," he said, breaking the silence. "Just waiting," she replied, her gaze fixed on the tree line. "For what?" Alyssa glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "You really need to ask?" Lachlan gave a soft chuckle, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Fair point." Before either of them could say more, the wind shifted, and with it, smoke. Alyssa stood abruptly, her nose wrinkling. "Do you smell that?" Lachlan tensed immediately, sniffing the air. His golden eyes narrowed. "Smoke," he said grimly. Alyssa spun toward the forest, scanning the trees. A faint orange glow flickered in the distance, growing brighter with each second. "No," she whispered. Lachlan cursed under his breath. "Kael." Flames began to dance along the edges of the woods, licking up the trunks of the trees like hungry fingers. The fire spread fast, faster than it should have. The snow did little to slow it down. "He's burning the forest," Alyssa said, heart racing. "He's cutting off our escape routes," Lachlan growled. Alyssa grabbed her rifle and slung it over her shoulder. "So what do we do?" Lachlan's eyes flickered with frustration, but he forced a steady breath. "We don't panic. We move to the clearing. Fire spreads slower there." "And if he's waiting for us in the clearing?" Lachlan looked at her, his expression dark. "Then we fight." The smoke thickened as Alyssa and Lachlan sprinted toward the open field just beyond the cabin. Sparks drifted through the air, and the heat of the approaching fire nipped at their backs. By the time they reached the clearing, the flames had already formed a semicircle, blocking the path back to the cabin. Alyssa coughed, waving the smoke from her face. "I'm really starting to hate your brother." "You're not the only one," Lachlan muttered. A low growl rumbled from the shadows ahead. Alyssa's heart skipped. One by one, wolves emerged from the smoke, their glowing eyes locked onto her and Lachlan. Then Kael stepped through the flames, completely unfazed by the fire surrounding him. His long coat barely flickered as the embers swirled around him. "Nice night, isn't it?" Kael said casually, as if he hadn't just torched half the forest. Lachlan shifted slightly in front of Alyssa, his muscles tensed and ready. "You're getting desperate, Kael." Kael chuckled. "Not desperate. Just efficient." Alyssa clenched her fists, glaring at him. "Is this really necessary? Burning down the whole forest just to get to us?" Kael's eyes flicked to her, his smile sharpening. "You're still thinking small, Alyssa. This isn't about your cabin or the land. It's about him." He nodded toward Lachlan. Alyssa frowned. "What are you talking about?" Lisa frowned, her hands in his coat pockets. The wolves around him moved with him, forming a tight semicircle. "You see," Kael said, locking eyes with Lachlan. "His death is the key to all of this." Alyssa's breath caught. "What?" Lachlan didn't respond, but his body stiffened. Kael's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "Your land isn't just protecting a barrier. It's anchored by Lachlan's life. As long as he's breathing, that boundary holds." Alyssa's heart dropped. "You're saying if he dies?" Kael finished smoothly. "The land becomes mine." Alyssa felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. She turned to Lachlan. "You knew?" Lachlan's jaw tightened. "I suspected." "And you didn't think to mention that little detail," she snapped. "I didn't want to give you one more reason to be afraid." Kael grinned. "Touching. Really." Alyssa's grip on the rifle tightened, her knuckles turning white. "You're not getting him," she growled. Kael chuckled, tilting his head. "Alyssa, let's not make this personal. I'm offering you a way out. Give him up, and this all ends. The fire stops, the wolves disappear. You can keep your land, no strings attached." Lachlan shifted closer to Alyssa. "Don't listen to him. But Alyssa didn't need Lachlan's warning. Your gaze hardened as she stared Kael down. I told you once. I'm not handing him over. You want him? You'll have to go through me first. Your life in my hands. Kael's smile faded slightly. Disappointing. I was hoping you'd be smarter than this. He raised his hand, and his wolves tensed, ready to attack. Lachlan shifted, his claws already forming as he growled. Alyssa lifted the rifle, aiming directly at Kael. Come on, then, she said, her voice cold. Let's finish this. Chapter 14. Falling Apart. The fire had reached the cabin. Alyssa could see the flames licking at the edges of the roof, smoke curling into the sky like a beacon of destruction. Her chest tightened as the warmth she'd built, her home, started to crumble before her eyes. But there wasn't time to mourn. Kael's wolves circled the clearing, their low growls vibrating through the cold night air. Lachlan stood in front of Alyssa, his wolf form battered and bloodied, but still standing tall. We can't hold them off much longer, Lachlan growled through gritted teeth. Lisa's hands trembled as she raised the rifle again. The barrel felt heavier than before, like the weight of everything pressed down on it. Then we'll have to try, she said, her voice firm despite the fear creeping into her bones. Kael stepped forward, cutting through the circle of wolves like he owned the place. His eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, and that smug smile hadn't left his face. Such a waste, Kael said, shaking his head. I offered you an easy way out, Alyssa. You should have taken it. Alyssa glared at him. I guess I'm not big on betrayal. Kael chuckled. It's not betrayal. It's survival. You really think you can keep this up forever? Lachlan growled low in his throat, stepping protectively between Alyssa and Kael. She's not alone, Lachlan snapped. Kael's eyes flicked to Lachlan, and that small, sharp smile grew. Not for long, Kael replied. Before Alyssa could react, Kael lunged. Lachlan shifted instantly, meeting Kael mid-air in a clash of fur and teeth. The two wolves slammed into the snow, snarling and rolling as they fought for dominance. Alyssa raised the rifle, tracking their movements, but the fight was too fast, too unpredictable. One wrong shot, and she'd hit Lachlan instead. Corbin was somewhere in the fray, firing bolts at the other wolves, but he was outnumbered. Alyssa could see two wolves circling him, keeping him pinned near the tree line. Then a shadow rushed at her. Alyssa barely had time to spin the rifle before a dark wolf tackled her, slamming her into the snow. The weapon skidded out of reach as she hit the ground hard, the weight of the wolf pinning her down. Alyssa grunted, shoving against the wolf's chest, but it was no use. Get off me, she hissed, struggling beneath the heavy weight. The wolf's jaws snapped, inches from her face, hot breath hitting her cheek. Through the corner of her eye, she saw them, Kael and Lachlan, locked in brutal combat. Kael had Lachlan by the throat, his jaws tightening with each passing second. Lachlan let out a strangled yelp, blood staining the snow beneath him. No, Alyssa whispered, panic gripping her chest. She thrashed under the wolf, pinning her down, clawing at the ground. But the more she struggled, the harder it pressed down. Kael slammed Lachlan against a tree, shifting back to his human form with frightening ease. Lachlan crumpled to the ground, his wolf form flickering as he shifted back to human, bloody and barely conscious. Kael crouched beside him, gripping Lachlan's hair and yanking his head up. I could end this now, Kael said, his voice eerily calm. Alyssa's heart pounded as she fought to break free, but the wolf wouldn't budge. Kael glanced toward her, holding Lachlan's limp form. But where's the fun in that? Kael added with a smirk. He released Lachlan, letting him collapse in the snow with a thud. Kael stood slowly, brushing his hands off like nothing had happened. You've got until the next full moon, he said, eyes locking with Alyssa's. I'll be back to finish him then, and trust me, you won't stop me next time. The wolf pinning Alyssa down finally released her, backing away to follow Kael. Alyssa scrambled to her feet, rushing to Lachlan's side. "Lachlan!" she shouted, gently shaking him. His eyes flickered open, but barely. He coughed weakly, gripping her hand. "I'm okay," he rasped, though the blood staining his side said otherwise. Alyssa glared at Kael's retreating figure. This wasn't over. Not even close. Chapter 15. Beneath the Surface. Elisa sat on the floor beside Lachlan, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. His breathing was shallow, but at least he was alive. For now. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Kael's smirk. The way he held Lachlan's life in his hands and let him go like it was some twisted game. Until the next full moon. The words echoed in her head like a countdown she couldn't ignore. Lachlan shifted slightly, grimacing as he tried to sit up. Elisa was at his side instantly, pressing a hand against his shoulder. "Don't," she said firmly. "You're still bleeding." "I'm fine," Lachlan muttered, though the color draining from his face suggested otherwise. Elisa rolled her eyes. "Yeah, sure, and I'm a unicorn." Lachlan smirked weakly. "You'd make a terrifying unicorn." "Stop trying to be charming, it's not working." Despite the banter, Elisa couldn't shake the knot in her stomach. Kael had nearly killed him, and next time he wouldn't hold back. She needed answers. Fast. An hour later, Lachlan had fallen into a restless sleep. Elisa sat by the fire, rummaging through an old leather bag Lachlan had brought with him when he first arrived. She wasn't usually the nosy type, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Inside the bag were a few faded shirts, a hunting knife, and most importantly, a bundle of old papers wrapped in cloth. Elisa unwrapped them carefully. A bundle of old papers wrapped in cloth. Elisa ran her fingers down the folded papers and read it through carefully. The handwriting was messy, written in a language she didn't recognize at first. But beneath the scribbled notes were diagrams, sketches of symbols that looked eerily similar to the ones Lachlan had carved into the cabin walls. "What is this?" she muttered, flipping through the pages. One particular drawing caught her eye. It was a rough map, but she recognized the layout instantly. It was her land, her cabin, the clearing and the surrounding woods. A small mark sat directly beneath the cabin's foundation, labeled with one word: stone. Alyssa frowned. There's something under the cabin. Her eyes narrowed as she continued reading. The notes mentioned Kael by name, along with references to boundaries, barriers, and anchors. One sentence stood out, underlined twice. The stone's power can bind or break, but it cannot act alone. Blood seals the bond. Elisa leaned back, exhaling slowly. So, this was it, the land's power, the thing Kael wanted so badly. Wasn't just some mystical barrier. It was tied to this stone beneath the cabin. But if the stone was the key, why hadn't Lachlan mentioned it? Lachlan stirred a few minutes later, groaning softly as he tried to sit up again. "You really need to stop moving," Alyssa said, placing the papers on the table. Lachlan's gaze flickered to the documents, and his expression immediately darkened. You went through my stuff. Oh, don't get all territorial, Alyssa shot back. I'm trying to keep you alive. Lachlan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I wasn't hiding it from you. Alyssa raised an eyebrow. Could have fooled me. Lachlan winced. I was going to tell you. I just didn't think we'd get to this point. Well, we're here, Alyssa said flatly, tapping the drawing. Now tell me, what's under my cabin? Lachlan hesitated, leaning heavily against the arm of the couch. It's an anchor stone, he explained, part of the land's magic. It holds the boundary in place, but it can also destroy it. Kael knows that. Alyssa's eyes narrowed. So why not destroy it ourselves? Wouldn't that stop him? Lachlan shook his head. It's not that simple. The stone is connected to the land and to us. You can't activate it without a bond. Alyssa crossed her arms. What kind of bond? Lachlan held her gaze, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. A blood bond. Silence hung between them for a long moment. Alyssa's eyes followed his. He placed a hand on her shoulder. You're kidding. I'm not. Lachlan shifted uncomfortably. A stone can't be used by just anyone. It has to recognize a tie between two people, a shared commitment to protect the land. Alyssa groaned, rubbing her temples. So, let me get this straight. We have to bond over this rock like it's some magical friendship bracelet? Lachlan smirked faintly. Something like that. Alyssa shot him a look. And you didn't think to mention this sooner? Why? I didn't think we'd need it. Kael's never gotten this far before. Well, he's far enough now, Alyssa said, standing. So, how do we do it? Lachlan hesitated. You're sure about this? Alyssa glanced out the window, watching the smoke still rising faintly from the edge of the woods. Kael wasn't going to stop, not until he got what he wanted. She turned back to Lachlan, determination settling in her chest. I've never been more sure. Alyssa stared at the papers spread across the cabin table, her eyes lingering on the word bond. It sounded simple enough. Activate the stone, protect the land, stop Kael. But the more she thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. A blood bond, a shared tie. She paced in front of the fire, running her fingers through her hair. What if it's not enough? She muttered under her breath. Lachlan, sitting on the couch with his injured arm propped up, glanced at her. It'll be enough. Alyssa stopped pacing to glare at him. How do you know that? You keep acting like this bond thing is a guaranteed win, but what if it's not? What if Kael breaks through anyway? Lachlan's calm, unbothered expression didn't shift. That's not going to happen. Alyssa threw up her hands. I love the confidence, but let's be real. Kael's already burned half the forest, nearly killed you, and left a "see you soon" note carved into my cabin. Lachlan's lips twitched, but he didn't smile. I think you're exaggerating the note part. Alyssa pointed at him. I'm serious, Lachlan. What if we're wasting time with this? For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft crackling of the fire. Finally, Lachlan set his mug down and leaned forward. I get it, he said quietly. You don't trust it. You don't trust me. Alyssa shifted uncomfortably. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. The worst part, he wasn't wrong. Alyssa crossed her arms, staring at the floor. I hadn't handled things on my own for a long time, Lachlan nodded. I know. But this isn't something you can handle alone. Maybe it'd be easier to just give Kael what he wants. The thought was bitter, but it was there, lingering like smoke that wouldn't clear. Later that night, Alyssa sat on the porch steps, staring at the snow-covered clearing. The fire inside the cabin flickered against the windows, casting long shadows across the ground. Lachlan's words still echoed in her head, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the doubt. She was so caught up in her thoughts that she almost didn't hear the soft crunch of footsteps behind her. Alyssa, she turned quickly, hand instinctively going to the rifle at her side. But it wasn't Kael. It was Corbin. Jeez, Alyssa sighed, lowering the rifle. You've scared the hell out of me. Corbin smirked as he trudged up the porch steps, brushing snow off his coat. Relax. If I were Kael, I wouldn't knock. Alyssa raised an eyebrow. What are you doing back already? I thought you were scouting farther south. I was, Corbin replied, his tone shifting. But I found something you'll want to hear. Alyssa leaned against the railing. All right, hit me. Corbin crossed his arms, his expression more serious than usual. Kael's forces are gearing up for something big, but there's a catch. He's vulnerable during the next lunar eclipse. Alyssa blinked. Lunar eclipse? Corbin nodded. It messes with his abilities, makes it harder for him to command the pack. If you're going to strike, that's the time to do it. Alyssa's heart raced. Maybe there was hope. When is it? She asked. Corbin's smirk returned. Tomorrow night. Alyssa let out a slow breath, the weight in her chest lifting slightly. Maybe they didn't have to rely on some mystical bond after all. Maybe they could fight Kael on their terms. As she turned back toward the cabin, Lachlan appeared at the doorway, his gaze flicking between her and Corbin. What's going on? Lachlan asked, sensing the shift in the air. Alyssa smiled faintly, the fire in her chest reigniting. We have a new plan. Alyssa sat cross-legged in front of the fire, hands wrapped around a warm mug. The soft glow lit the cabin walls, but the warmth couldn't chase away the nerves swirling in her chest. Lachlan sat across from her, stretching his injured shoulder carefully. His face was calm, but she caught him wincing more than once. You're terrible at pretending you're fine, Alyssa said, smirking over the rim of her mug. Lachlan chuckled softly. And you're terrible at hiding when something's bothering you. Alyssa sighed, setting her cup down with a soft clink. Corbin's news helps, but I still don't know if I can go through with this bond thing. Lachlan leaned back against the couch, his golden eyes fixed on the fire. I get it. Trusting people isn't exactly your thing. Alyssa gave a dry laugh. Yeah, I wonder why. Everything, frankly. Lachlan was quiet for a moment, the crackling of the fire filling the silence between them. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke. I wasn't much for trusting people either, he said quietly. Alyssa raised an eyebrow. Could have fooled me. I'm serious, Lachlan replied, eyes distant like he was looking at something far away. The first time I shifted, I thought I'd lose my mind. The pain. Everything about it. It felt like I was being ripped apart. Alyssa leaned in slightly. What happened? Lachlan's lips curved into a faint smile, but there was something soft about it. Kael was supposed to be there for me, but he wasn't. He thought I needed to learn how to handle it alone. Classic Kael logic. Alyssa frowned. Sounds like him. Lachlan nodded. I nearly lost control. I remember tearing through the woods, not knowing what I was or what I'd become. I probably would have run until I collapsed if it wasn't for someone else. Alyssa's curiosity piqued. Who? Lachlan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. Her name was Mira. She was part of our pack. Older than me, but she was kind. Lachlan finally met her eyes, his gaze steady. I know the bond thing sounds like some mystical nonsense, but it's not just about magic. It's about trust. Trusting that someone else will stand with you, even when things fall apart. Alyssa swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She wasn't used to leaning on others, but Lachlan had done nothing but fight for her. Again and again. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't so bad to let someone in. So, Alyssa said, forcing a smirk. You're saying I have to like you to save this place? Lachlan grinned. I'm saying you have to trust me. Liking me is just a bonus. Alyssa rolled her eyes, but the warmth in her chest wasn't something she could ignore anymore. She glanced at the old papers on the table, the words blood bond standing out under the firelight. All right, she said, exhaling slowly. Let's do it. Lachlan sat up, eyes narrowing slightly. You sure? Yeah. Alyssa crossed her arms. I'm not letting Kael take this land. If the bond is what it takes, then I'm in. Lachlan nodded, but his expression shifted just a little, like there was something he hadn't mentioned yet. Okay, he said carefully. There's just one thing you should know before we start. Alyssa frowned. What? Lachlan rubbed the back of his neck, clearly trying to figure out how to phrase it. The ritual requires more than just cutting our palms and saying some ancient words. Alyssa's eyes narrowed. How much more? Well, Lachlan coughed. The bond is only sealed after, mating for 3 days straight. Alyssa nearly choked on air. I'm sorry, what? Lachlan winced, clearly bracing for her reaction. It's part of the ritual, something about strengthening the connection. Alyssa stared at him, wide-eyed. Let me get this straight. You're saying I have to be stuck with you for 3 days doing that? Lachlan raised his hands in mock defense. Hey, I didn't write the rules. Alyssa groaned, dragging her hands down her face. Oh, this just keeps getting better. Lachlan smirked. Could be worse. How, exactly? You could be bonding with Corbin. Alyssa snorted despite herself. Fair point. She took a deep breath, shaking her head. Fine, let's get this over with. Lachlan chuckled. I'll try not to take that personally. Alyssa shot him a look, but couldn't help the small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Kael wanted to burn everything she'd built to the ground, but if she had to fight fire with, well, Lachlan, so be it. At least they'd do it together.